First of all, thanks for joining. This is now the second series of the Webcast series on API security. Hopefully you've seen last week's webcast or the recording of my colleague with regards to API security in general, how to mitigate attacks, etc. So today we'll cover in specific the OAuth 2.0 standard, as we've seen that it's getting more and more important and gaining more momentum in nowadays IT. I'm Mike Anau. I'm the senior consultant here for pre-API management at CA Technologies, and I hope you will enjoy today's session. So first of all, let's have a quick look at the logistics here. So what we will cover, first of all, is the topic of OAuth, but in the meantime and in the middle, we will have one poll. So you're asked, have some questions about yourself, so feel free to answer. In the meantime, wherever there are any kind of questions, feel free to shoot them into the chat window or also into the Q&A window. So wherever you see something where you can write anything, feel free to put them in there. And at the end, if you would like to, and if you will have time for it slightly before 4 a.m., then we can also look into some questions, and feel free to unmute yourself then. So those are the logistics here on this call. And as I've mentioned, this is now the second one, so securing APIs with OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. The next one will be next week with the topic of corporate entity and governance, meaning that security is important from the outside, but this will take a look also from the security from inside. So who has access to what and who is able to publish services, specific types of services, etc. So obviously also quite important topic here. So let's have a look, let's have a quick recapitulation here. So APIs, as you already know, are the building blocks of a digital transformation. They allow you to create new revenue streams, new business model, and completely reorganize your IT so that you then at the end have a service-based, service-oriented architecture up to a also microservices architecture. So those are the blocks you should use in the future to create your software, your pieces of software, your whole enterprise solutions. And this at the same time allows you to create also new digital transformation initiatives here. So the pathways, you may have seen them as somewhere, is about integration, security, acceleration of development, and unlocking the value of your own data and data silos. So what we will focus here on is the security piece, as the topic is OAuth, right? So why OAuth 2.0? So there's many discussions around, some like it, some don't. It's a standard. What's the state of the standard? So let's quickly have a look here. So I'm covering now let's say, some key points of OAuth 2.0. We'll have a look into OpenID Connect, and then we will go at the later stage into what does the flow technically look like, and how is it then realized within CA Technologies solutions here in API management. So let's have a look at OAuth. So I've had a look at some polls, and people said that within that questionnaire that 80% of them dislike traditional registration forms, meaning that if you have a mobile app, web application, whatever it is, if there's a typical registration form and you don't see anywhere the Google, LinkedIn, Facebook button to just make the registration a matter of 1 or 2 seconds, then users dislike it. And as we know, the user, the consumer, is at the focus of every company. So this has to be at the focus always. Well, and therefore also 73% of those users overall prefer to log in using their social accounts. So here you see the first touch point, seamless login, social logins in combination with OAuth, because OAuth allows you to do that. Why? We will see later on. So currently, just to give you an insight on the preferences, currently what companies are using as a social login provider is on 66% of all Facebook, 20% Google, 6% Twitter, and then we have 2% LinkedIn, etc. So we see that it's pretty common. It's more or less the standard that you have some social buttons to log in to allow your customers, etc., to log into your systems via any social provider or any other third-party system. So before we go into great detail here, I would just like to have a quick poll and would like to ask you about what your current stage is of OAuth, because, well, we have also some results, and maybe they will match, maybe they won't. So in a couple of seconds, you will see a poll then, and I would just encourage you to just to make check your marks wherever you think they will be. So, what's your OAuth stage? That's the question here. So, are you using it actively? Are you using also OpenID Connect actively, or currently implementing, having other mechanisms, or as we also see in some specific industries, or it's interpreted that way, that OAuth 2.0 is insufficient for the company? So let's just have it a few more seconds, and let's wait for the answers. If you won't have that many answers, then well, let's just skip it. So I'll have it for 1 minute now. So I'm seeing that using other mechanisms, car implementing, there's some responses here. Let's have a look. Perfect. So that's interesting. So we've seen responses, let's say 30% actively using OAuth, 25% currently implementing, and 15% using other mechanisms, and the rest didn't respond. So that's fine. So thank you very much for your responses. Well, there's here some infographic on the OAuth adoption. So we see 51% of a poll we conducted in combination with OAuth.io states that 51% of enterprises already use it as a resource provider. So which side do they implement here? You see almost 50% the client, a resource provider 6%, and both 44%. So those are the stats here, just to give you a little insight. And also, as of the standard, it's of course should be more or less OAuth 2.0 used by 81% here. Just to give a little insight here. So what is OAuth 2.0 under the hood? So let's go into the specifics, but still keep it simple because we're in a webcast here. We can discuss more into detail afterwards. So how did it look like before OAuth? So what's the matter here? Before OAuth, you just had to log in at a third party, and that third party had to check the credentials against the actual user store or against the actual identity endpoint. So there was obviously a lack of trust for those unknown applications where you just had to put in your credentials, which were then passed by. Any company, any startup can say, I will handle your credentials securely, but you shouldn't trust them. Well, phishing attacks were then very simple, and this was all or nothing. So you can either have complete access to all your data or nothing. So that was more or less how it looked like before the OAuth standard came into play. So in one sentence, what is OAuth? So OAuth, as I will be reading it now, is a specification that allows users to delegate access to their data to third-party services without sharing their username and password with that service. So you have highlighted two sections here. Delegate access, meaning that we give someone the right to use the data of mine, but we do that without sharing our username and password with that service we want to have the data from, or the service we allow to get data from ourselves. So delegate access is here the big keyword. And most importantly, now it's much more secure because we tell username and password only to that endpoint, only to that server, server we trust. So let's have a look quickly at the general terminology, because OAuth is a long specification, so there are many words included and there's many types, etc. So let's have a look at the verbs. So authentication is the action of verifying a user's identity. Authorization is the action of verifying a user has permission to do something. So authentication would be yes, that's you, person XYZ. An authorization is, yes, person XYZ has actually access to do or perform this action. Then we have federated authentication, so that's using a third-party system to authenticate users, and delegated authentication. So this would be granting someone the permission to act on your behalf. Just to have a look into the words here. And from the nouns perspective, the resource owner within the OAuth specification and the framework is the person who has the ability to grant the access on a resource. So this is the user. You own the resources. If you have an app and you log in, you own the data, and you will say, and you will define what can be done or what can be visible, what can be used by the third party. The client is actually then that third party, that client, web app, single page app, mobile app, who is then making actually the request to show you the data. So it's a middleman between the actual data at the end and the client where you will see it. And the authorization server is then this point where you will get consent to access the resource server. So the client will tell me, log in, so that you can use me as a resource owner. I say, all right, but I would like to go to the authorization server where I would say, and I will grant the consent for you. And the server at the end may be also on the side of the auth server, but is then actually the endpoints. This is the real data which will be retrieved, and those are then protected by OAuth, by a specific token, as we will see. So that's for the general terminology. And actually those on the left bottom, the federated authentication and delegated authorization, are really those things we're talking about when we speak about OAuth. Because it is federated authentication, so we can use a third-party system with OAuth to authenticate users or ourselves. And delegated authorization is actually that I grant someone the permission to act on my behalf. So if I would have whatever server or whatever service, and I would like to log in with my Facebook or Google credentials to give for example, fill in my personal details and a photo, then I give the client the access to my Facebook account, but I grant it just with the permissions to see my personal information, as you may see from some login windows. And then this client has the delegated authorization and the access to those informations to edit them, to retrieve them on my behalf only. So that's here the core message of OAuth. So because there's different types of devices, so some may be a mobile application, a web application, and moreover, the logic where this, let's say, mechanism is enforced can be either on the client side, so this can be visible for all of us, or it can be actually handled on the server side, and we will just see the result, which is on one hand much more secure, but on the other hand, it allows you, or it always requires a call to the server. So there are many types and profiles, and let's have a quick look into them here. So client types. There's a client type which is confidential, meaning that the client is capable of keeping a client password confidential to the word. As I've mentioned, a server-side web app. So you can enforce OAuth with a web application, and you can define yourself as a confidential type if you work with the OAuth mechanism on the server side, because no one will see it then there. But public, because this would be a client which is not able to handle and to keep the client password confidential, would be, for example, a single-page web app where the processing is on the client side, or a mobile application which can be reverse engineered, and the client ID of that device can be retrieved here. So there's two different types, and also for that two different types, there's different implementations. And then there are client profiles. So again, it can be a server-side web app. It can be a client-side app running in a browser. It can be a native app, so iOS, Android, mobile devices in general, also desktop devices. But then you can also have a hybrid of all of those three combined, let's say. But overall, it's important to know that OAuth considers different client types and different client profiles here. So let's have a look at one of those flows here. So in this case, we will have a user, then we will have a browser, we will have a web server, we will have an authorization server, and we will have a resource server. So user wants to access actually the resource itself via the client app. So the client app is visible for us in this example, and all afterwards will be handled by this client app, except the authorization, the login. This is what the user will see. So let's have a look at the flow here. Those are the usual sequence diagrams you will see when you Google for the OAuth flows and different types. So let's have a look at one of those examples, and which is also the most, let's say, the most complex and with the most handshakes, etc. So the rest of them will then be pretty easy to understand. So we enter a URL and go to the browser. Well, the browser then opens the URL, and the web server then, when there is the login process, starts the OAuth process. So what will happen? The web server is saying, you would like to log in, all right, but you've chosen the Facebook login, so I will redirect you to the authorization server of a third party. So the browser actually then on the client side opens this redirect URL to redirect the user to another window. This is exactly what you usually see when you log in and another window opens up. So the authorization server afterwards will present the user interface of the authorization, which is usually just the username and the password then to fill in, and the browser passes it back to the user. Then we log in and we authorize, meaning that we type in our credentials, the password. We then may also fill in what scope we would like to have defined. So this is the scope defines what information can the client retrieve. The browser submits it to the authorization server directly. This authorization server, once they detect a valid username and password, will create a so-called authorization code. So this is a code which will be redirected to the web server and then to the client application. So that client application now has possessing the authorization code. So by possessing this authorization code, they will present it to the auth server, saying that I have received the code and I'm now actually able to get the data from Mr. Auth server. So you actually change. So the client app is interchanging the authorization code for a access token. So it will switch. This access token will tell the client app, or will give the client app the access then to the protected resource with the access token sent, and the client app will receive the protected resource, which may be some of your data you will get back, and it's passed back to the browser, and the user will see it. So this is one example, and this is the so-called, you may have heard it, authorization code grant. So this is the auth code here, where we will, which is then, well, interchanged and traded with the access token. So here in this case, there is a web server in between in the middle. So this is the yellow line here. This is the yellow server. Therefore, we can actually use this flow because the client or the identification of that client is secure because it's hidden on the web server. If you would have only a browser where all the logic would be within that browser, you need to handle it differently. We will not go into great detail, but I can tell you some of the grant types here. We've seen the authorization code grant. This is called 3-legged OAuth and is suitable for server-side web apps and now also mobile apps as a recommendation. Then there's implicit grant. This is a different one, suited more for mobile apps and native apps here, as I mentioned. Then you have a password grant where you directly send the password, a refresh token grant, so to get not only a token but a refresh token, and a client credentials grant. And this is called 2-legged OAuth because this goes directly then from the client to the authorization server here. Refresh token grant, just as an FYI here, is the ability to not only send the access token, which is traded against the auth code, but also refresh token. So why do we actually give or hand out the refresh token for someone? Why is the access token not enough? You may ask yourself. It's pretty simple. It's a user experience matter, because you will deliver an access token with a lifetime of, for example, 1 day, but then you pass on a refresh token again. So that's just a string of numbers and letters. But what happens there is, when the lifetime of the access token expires, the refresh token usually has a much longer lifetime of 1 week or 1 month, for example, which means that if the user will come after that day with the expired access token, then the web application or the client can simply just take the refresh token and get a new one, trade this refresh token for a new access token to get new access without the user having to log in. So you can then implement all of your own mechanisms. If we're in the banking space, we also would like to have two-factor authentication. We would like to have stricter validation and stricter expiration dates of those tokens. But in general, this is what refresh tokens are for. In the infographic here, you see also that companies we've been talking with already implement also a refresh mechanism, whereas 57% say yes, we do implement or require a token refresh mechanism. Then there is also a way to store, how to store the states of those tokens here. So some might use a NoSQL database data source, some might use a SQL data source, some in memory. So you see there's different ways here, but it really depends on how you would like to implement it here. So let's have a look into the demonstration now. So some of you may know for this demonstration and where OAuth is sitting actually is in the so-called C-API management suite here. So C-API management, with its core component, consists of the so-called API gateway. So if you're familiar with web services, etc., the core message and the core value of such a gateway is that you have your backend services and you position that API gateway right in the middle between your internal backend services and the external-facing third-party apps, business-to-business connections, mobile apps, or web apps. So this is where the API gateway is located, and actually on that API gateway, there is the whole OAuth implementation already in place. So to show it to you visually, as an example, we have a user, we have a client, and we have the gateway. We have behind the protected resource, and also to authenticate the user, we have some identity and access management in place. Here it's important to mention that the API gateway is able to actually act as the authorization and resource server, because it's authorizing it on the gateway, but then also the request flows through the gateway onto the resource itself. So let's go through some steps here. Well, as a client, also in the previous example, we require access to a protected resource. So it goes through the gateway to the authorization server, and we have to enter our credentials. So what's important here is that the API gateway is then able to actually use any of your identity and access management solutions to authenticate against the person. So any company already has an existing identity management tool or at least some data store or user store. So the API gateway is integrated with that, and you can select which one to choose. So once you're logged in here, the API gateway redirects the user back to the client with this authorization code. And then the client is using this code to request actually a token from the gateway. All right, the API gateway, if authenticated, if client is valid, and if the client ID identification is correct, then the gateway issues a signed and encrypted OAuth access token. Much more technical, a little bit more technical, this is a JSON Web Token to the client. And then that client is actually able to connect to the protected resource. The gateway recognizes this is now a call to a resource itself. Does it have a OAuth token? Yes, it does. I will send it back to the protected resource. So that's the usual flow here, just as an example. So now let's have a look how to actually do this, how to actually enforce the OAuth implementation here. So for that, I will use the API gateway interface for that. So I'll connect to one of my tools where I will actually expose a service based on some backend service, and I will add some functionalities to then require the OAuth token. And then one of my colleagues built a little testing tool so we can get into the nitty-gritty, into the details of how the OAuth handshakes are actually working between them. So let's now open here the so-called Policy Manager, which is the tool with which we are connecting to the gateway. So for now, let's create a simple service here. Just to give you an insight, we have here this endpoint called demo data, and this will retrieve us some infos of some cities. So that's our usual backend API. We can send a request and it's fine. So what we're doing now, simply, we publish a web API here. Let's call it Secure API. The target URL is the backend, and to the outside, we call it Secure API. So then a business partner, customer, client would call it on https://whatever.yourcompany.com/secure API. So as we click finish, the policy is being created. And you will see there's one piece of a block here. So that's the routing. So what it simply does, request comes in, it hits this so-called policy, so this rule window, and it redirects it to the backend service and passes the result back to the client. Nothing more, nothing less. So we now would like to add some more functionalities. First of all, to just make it secure, standard secure, we drag and drop a SSL TLS transport assertion block here, so that's fine. Save and activate, and it's running on the gateway. As an additional step, what we would like to do, and this is where we get into the OAuth, it's as simple as that. OTK require OAuth 2.0 token. I've searched in the box here. I drag and drop it inside. I can type in some scope, so I would like to have a required scope here defined. OAuth scopes are used to, let's say, restrict the access. The scope would be the example of a Facebook login, which if you would like to share your personal information, your posts, your messages, your friends lists. So all of those things are so-called scopes in OAuth. And the cache validation result is the lifetime of that specific token retrieved. So you will have some information here, the rest we can leave as is. So we put that in here, that's fine. We can again save, but what we would like to have also, and what is possible here with the API gateway, is we can customize the error response. So before an error will happen, we can actually change it. So to see it then later on, in case something happens, we can say the response content type is JSON, and here I actually put some JSON message saying error auth via OAuth 2.0 required. And I hit OK. And that's actually it. So that's a basic configuration of OAuth here. So the OTK require OAuth 2.0 token block will actually enforce a valid OAuth token within that request to the end source. But well, that's just the end, right? If a client will reach that endpoint, secure API, he actually already needs to have this access token. But before achieving that, there's actually many things to be done to actually be able to retrieve it here. So if you would like have a look directly onto the policy manager, and here's some postman to see the result, we can actually send a request and we see auth via OAuth 2.0 required, and we actually call the HTTPS port with secure API. So we've called a new endpoint available on the API gateway now. So let's get into the details and let's have a look how OAuth in action looks like. So for this we will use now the OAuth test client developed by one of our colleagues, where we can actually see in great detail how this is actually enforced and how the flow works. So again, I'm opening the policy manager, This is not the place where I would like to be, but let's have it here. So we're now at the OAuth test client. So this is a simple window where we will see all the steps required for this, and we will now go through the steps and we will see what's necessary here. So, as a first step now, we have the server settings. So, well, and we select the authorized code grant from the slide you've seen previously. So, what will happen? First of all, we type in the host name. So this is usually what's needed to call to get some of those tokens here. First point is covered. Let's have a look at the client settings. All right, so here we have client ID and client secrets. Well, so how do we get to those client IDs and client secrets? Here, actually, I'd like to introduce you to the so-called developer portal, because this is another part of C API management. This allows developers from outside to onboard themselves by logging in, registering, and creating their APIs to get the so-called API key. Because at the end, we would like to have this API key here, and we would like to put it in. This key is composed of an ID and a secret. So if we hit here, Get Started, we can select the organization we belong to, and we can have some test application here. Well, we can have a next step where we will choose the APIs you would like to be associated with. I accept the terms, and I continue. But to make it a little bit shorter here, I go to my application section where I already have two of the apps here. So I have a test app Android. So this would be the usual scenario where you have internal or external developers wanting to use your API portfolio. So here I would go to the Edit section, and under Auth I will actually find the API key and the secret as they belong here. So what I will simply do is I'll take the API key, that's the identification of the client, and the secret. This allows me, and this will let the gateway know that this resource or this client is actually registered and is actually allowed to protect or actually allowed to access this here. If someone, for example, lost a shared secret, obviously you can create a new shared secret here. So that's the application section. So let's have a look back onto the test client here. So we've inserted the client settings. So now we can go ahead into the authorization grant settings. So the endpoint URI is already pre-filled auth OAuth v2 authorize. So it would be the gateway and this URI. The redirect URI is actually here this test client, so where the request is hitting back. You saw it here as well. It's again reflected in the application section, because here we will see this callback has to be actually registered, because then the OAuth or the API gateway knows that it is sending the authorization code back to a trusted source. So this is actually the point where the auth token is getting hit back to the client, and afterwards it's being traded with the other token. So again, we have it here. That's fine. We can have any state here, and we define the scope. So that's the first part. So what we now can do is we can actually authorize. So what will happen? It opens a new window. That's the authorization server as you know it with the social logins. Just more importantly, this time it's actually the CA Technologies or the API Gateway authorization server presenting you here with this login screen. So what we will do simply, we will enter again, as I'm using always the admin, the login. So what happens next? What do you think? Exactly. The scope comes up. So as usual, as you will define what profile information, what type of information you would like to give permissions to be accessed by the client, you grant it. So let's grant it here. And we see authorization granted. So we can now return back to the OAuth test client, where we will now have the authorization code. So we retrieve the code. To give a little insight what the URL looks like, it's API-MCA auth authorize, and here after the question mark we have actually some data. So response type is code, that's the code grant. Here we have the client ID. Then we have the state, the scope, and the redirect URI, which is here now this callback. So we actually give information to the authorization server that this is the type, this is the flow we want to use, and this is our identification here. So we can now actually go back here and we can go next the additional step. So we're now at the stage where we would like to trade the authorization code here with the so-called access token. So we go to step 4. We got the authorization code, and we got now another endpoint to get the token actually. So by clicking here, we can retrieve the access token. It's also quite nice to see what's the response here, because we will get here now the access token, the token type bearer, the expiration in seconds, and the refresh token and the scope allowed. So we actually now get a access token and we get a refresh token. So two types of strings, two types of data we can actually now use from a client perspective to access this protected resource at the very end. So we could look at step 5 where we have now the refresh token. So you will see by hitting this would be now, for example, a web application or a mobile app. Once we hit this, so once we hit the endpoint with the refresh token, on this token endpoint, you will see that we actually get another access and another refresh token. So all our data are now refreshed, and the expiration date now is postponed to the new to a new value. And at the end, we can have a look at send request. So here we have now the actual access token, and we have now here the protected resource. We now have actually the protected resource URL. So if we have a look quickly back at what the secure API is here, so the endpoint can actually now go here. We can put in the protected resource URL, and we can send a request, and you will see we have some cities: Abu Dhabi, country ID, Aqua, Adana, any other cities. So we actually got the data now by having the access token and by just having a policy which looks as simple as this on the right. So this is OAuth in action, and this is in specific the authorization code grant. So moreover, the API Gateway supports all types of grants here, but we've looked now into the most complex, so be confident to have a look into others. Those are then more simple and just slight tweaks of this one. All right, perfect. Everything worked. I was already sweating that something will not work out, but luckily everything's fine. So let's have a look into one another topic, and this is the developer experience. Here we get into this portal we've seen previously on with the web-based GUI. And all I want to talk about quickly is the developer experience here, because when you would like to give someone the access to your APIs, in the example of banking and of PSD2, where banks have to open up their data and account information in the next months, years, they need to make sure that the fintechs, the startups, or any mashup project which is using some of your APIs will understand how your API works. So therefore, this is actually the point where the portal comes into place. So if we have a look now here, this is the application section, all right, but more importantly, a developer would usually go into the API catalog, where he would like to see, okay, I have this hello, this math, and a weather API, and I see how many applications are using it. Well, that's fine with me, of course. Then I will have my my applications. So I can either create a new one, but then just to check, we see we selected the APIs we want to subscribe to. So that's, again, fine with me. So we see we have the Math API already subscribed, so I can cancel, and I actually have my API, my app, and I can use it. So to give a developer insight on how your authorization flow works and how the API looks like, we have the so-called API Explorer here. So here, you select the API you would like to use. Let's have a look at the Math API. And let's select an application to test it with, because what we would like to have is we would like to have the API we want to test, the app credentials we're using, and we will now want to see what's the auth type, what's the grant type of OAuth, what's our API key and secret, and what's the scope, and last but not least also what's the token endpoint, and what's the authorization endpoint. So that it's not only important for a developer to see the endpoint itself on the right here, but only on the left to see how the authorization is managed. So if we get to an endpoint here, let's make it a little bigger in the example of this add endpoint. So this is just a sample API where I can just add a few numbers and they will add them. So I can add a 2 and I can add a 6 here. And now I can actually submit the request and I should see the result. And again, for a developer, I'm prompted to enter my credentials via the authentication server on the API gateway. And as I log in and grant the access, I will actually see the result here. So this is exactly the window I would like to see from a developer perspective. I see the method, I see the request URL, I see the parameters, I see the response code, I see the header, I see the response body. 2 plus 6 is 8, so the API works quite fine. And last but not least, code samples to actually select a programming language where I then actually see, for example, in Java, I would like to call this endpoint. The method is get. This is the property. So this is actually at the very end where you have a header with authorization bearer. This is the access token, besides the refresh token, which is used to authenticate here. And the response code, you will get it already written out in your client application. So this is actually now the API Explorer, and we've also seen that this is now, and again, a much more convenient way to also test out the OAuth flow. So let's just hit a couple of more times. You will see why. Obviously, I'm not nervous. I'm just hitting here at this endpoint. I will get always the same result. So because we have a couple of more minutes here, we can spend also more time on the portal here. So if we go to the analytics section, this will actually tell you the importance of having a client ID and secret. So here we see a real-time analytics dashboard of the API hits in the last week, of the hits in the last week, of the average latency and the error rate here. So hits by application. You would like to see from a management perspective and also from an IT ops perspective, what application is hitting my APIs the most. You see here that the app test app Android, which I've had here, had 64 hits in the last week. I can select it to the last month, and here the last 30 days, and we will see this had 84 hits actually. We have another test app who had 7 hits, and then another one with 1 hit. So this actually gives you an insight on the usage and also on the latency. So without a client or without the ability to create apps from a developer perspective, you wouldn't be actually able to see what's happening in the end. Because at the end, this is the main message here with OAuth, the applications, the authentication of the app itself, let's say some startup who wants to create a fancy application, differs from your actual login information here, which you would pass to another authorization server, to some social provider, etc. So that's the value behind having the API keys in place. And last but not least, let's have a quick look at behind the scenes of the OAuth Toolkit, because this is actually the place where all of this is enforced, where all of the flows, how all of this is implemented. So as I've mentioned, we were always speaking about the API gateway and about the portal. Those are the two main components of API management. And the CI OAuth Toolkit is a upgrade, is a bundle you just apply on the gateway, and all the necessary things are already there. So it's delivered with the API gateway, and we call it OAuth Toolkit. So let's have a look what's behind it. First of all, we've created this one policy here, right? This secure API endpoint. This has 4 of those blocks now. The OAuth Toolkit also creates policies. It creates tens of different policy endpoints which can be used and can be called by the client. So it creates for you the public OAuth endpoints and also some of those blocks on the top as we saw. This is on a technical level, what is created for you within the OAuth Toolkit. Well, because of the various enterprise requirements our customers have, it's pre-built for you, but yet it's fully customizable. So you can use your own identity store, as I've mentioned. You can use also an external token store where the tokens are stored, and you can modify the lifetime of tokens and more and more and more. So let's have a look how this OAuth Toolkit actually looks like. So at the bottom here, we actually see the list of endpoints on a specific gateway server. We have it structured in folders, and this OTK is actually the point where the OAuth Toolkit is located. So if we expand it a little bit, let's have a look at what the things are. So I will go directly into the most relevant points here: authorization server, token server, and the documentation as a Swagger document. So here we see, if we go a little bit in, this is the folder created with this extension. There's the OAuth 1.0 standard, if needed. But mainly here OAuth 2.0. So this is the authorization server, where we'll actually get the authorization code here. So you will see, and we used it before, OAuth v2 authorize. There is a consent endpoint, there is a login endpoint, which actually gives you the user interface you've seen. And then you have a logout, session logout. So the client is actually also able to log out and to cancel the whole session. And then the token server. So this is the part where we've actually then received the refresh and the access token. So this would be this endpoint here. And you can actually also revoke it. So there's all the functionality needed as part of the so-called endpoints here. So if I just open one of those, you will see it's definitely a little bit more than the ones we've had before, but it's all pre-built for you, and you don't even have to touch it to make it work. So you will have it working as you've seen it now. But obviously, there are many fragments, many types of other reusable fragments of those policies where you can actually modify it. So at the end, this is what I would like to emphasize. It's pre-built, but it's based on the policy technology, or based on the policy manner of creating things on the gateway, meaning that if you would like to just quickly customize this error response here, you can just change it here. So because of the way how this is built, you're actually able to fully customize it here. So if I would go to some OTK client dbget, this is actually the way how to get the client information and to validate here. So I would actually make here, there are actually many ways, from the OAuth request, etc. So I wouldn't like to go into much detail here, but you can actually use it here and modify it by just taking one of those 200 blocks on the left and putting in your own logic to the right. We can obviously help you with that, but there's also a quite comprehensive documentation where you then at the end can also have a look how all of this works. So for example here, the OAuth APIs would be here also described, and you will see what's the parameters and what is all needed to make all of this working. So that's how the OAuth Toolkit looks like. Then there is also here the way to, let's have a look at the resource server and a Connect. So we have also an OpenID Connect example, so you can get some user information there. OpenID Connect is therefore also supported by the CAPI gateway, where you can retrieve some information and where, let's say, the user information then of the client profile or of your own data, name, password, email, etc., is stored also in the so-called JSON Web Token here. So if you go quickly on the authorized endpoint, if we would like to find here, actually you will see if I type in JWT, you see that we signed the payload within JSON Web Token here and add it then to the HTTP header. So summarized, API management provides you a complete mobile and IoT security platform, as you've seen, because you can use the OAuth Toolkit to enforce security for web apps, but also for APIs itself. So let's have a quick look at what the components are and where we're focusing. So CAPI management at the end has the live creator to create apps or create APIs based on databases, NoSQL and SQL, by just pointing to them, and the method and the metadata schema is creating you the API, the REST API for you automatically. So a completely new approach to development. The API gateway then allows you to connect to existing identity providers, leverage existing APIs and web services, open REST and message queues, and we connect to it through the policy manager which we were using. So that's the GUI we are using. So then at the next step, there is the API portal. So this is really to extend your partner system and enable external and internal developers. And then there is the mobile gateway, which is actually the same as the API gateway, just with much more functionalities and mobile SDKs we have on GitHub you can actually use to make mobile apps much quicker, because the SDKs speak and understand the language of the gateway and know all the endpoints necessary to make, for example, mobile single sign-on across devices, across applications, social logins out of the box, etc. And precision monitoring to get even more insight on a per service level of the API gateway. So a full-fledged OAuth Toolkit is actually provided within the API gateway here, where you can find all the necessary API endpoints to enforce OAuth here. Here you see Forrester, Gartner, Coppinger, Ovum. We're visible here in all of them, but you can read on them on your own. That's not what I'm here for. This is in general what OAuth is. So redirect the resource owner to the resource author. Well, OAuth Toolkit takes care of it with the CAPI gateway. This is what I wanted to highlight at this session. So from my end, this was all I wanted to demonstrate to you today. And if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A or in the chat. Also, if you would like to be unmuted by myself in the next 4 minutes, if you would like to, we can have a chat on that. And other than that, I thank you very much for your attendance. Thanks for coming. And please have a look also at the next webcast, which will happen next week at the same time and the same date by my other colleague here covering API management, which will be then around API governance. And API governance is then actually the way where we can manage who is actually able to create those policies, what different roles you can create, so that at the end you would have security policies handled by one person, and sample APIs or whatever APIs you would like to create, such as this, will be handled by another department, because this is also important and makes APIs much more secure. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Hope to see you, speak to you soon. If you have any questions, my email is here in the slide to see, and my LinkedIn profile if you would like also to connect with me. So thanks very much. Have a nice and pleasant day, rest of the day, and bye-bye.